We might have just witnessed the most interesting, the most incredible turning point in history of the use of AI. Now, you might have seen the movies. AI decides to take over the world. It makes a decision on its own to do something that takes control of the humans. But what we're going to talk about here is a little bit different. And actually, I think it's more interesting because we're talking about humans and AI working together in a way that perhaps many didn't imagine to be the case going forward. This month, in fact, just yesterday, there was a report released by Anthropic, and they're calling it the world's first documented cyber espionage campaign, orchestrated using their tools, Claude Anthropic to be specific, Claude Code if you know the tool set. And this wasn't just a matter of some simple automated scripting. No, it was a lot more complicated than that. And using Claude Code, they made actual progress. They were actually successful. Now, this is something that people in the atmosphere have been talking about for quite some time. If you can do powerful things with AI, there's both good and there's bad. And we've got to dive in and talk about these details. So we're going to break it down. We'll talk through the elements that are used in a typical cybersecurity, cyber investigation where they're breaking in, where they're trying to understand what's going on. And then we'll talk a little bit about what they did and what it means for us as we are thinking about the use of AI and especially making AI mistakes. So, what are we talking about here? Well, first, I want to show you. This is the Anthropic report that was released yesterday. It's titled Disrupting the First Reported AI Orchestrated Cyber Espionage Campaign. It's actually not a very big document, it's only about 13 pages. It's pretty straightforward. It's the full report. They gave us a nice little executive summary to tell us a little bit about what was happening. And I'm going to step through this in a couple of different ways. One, we're just going to talk about what happened, what Anthropic shared with us in terms of what they found in their investigation. And we're going to talk through what it means because I think there's a lot more to this than is readily apparent in the report. And of course, we always have to look more deeply, whether it's benchmarks or claims of efficacy. There's a little bit of reading between the lines that I think is necessary for us to do here. So let's talk through that. I mean, first thing here that I want to call out is this really is a big deal. The fact that Anthropic caught it, that there was some learnings that they were able to take away from it, and there were some real interesting developments in terms of how they were actually successful. Because we know that all of these foundational model companies are doing work to watch how we're using the tools. It's part of their responsibility. But what they found was that this was actually going on for quite some time. The way that they were using the tools was very adaptive. They also were very fast with the use of the technology. It makes it faster for everyone to do anything. I mean, look, I'm not going to lie. When I'm putting together these reports, I'm using the AI to process a lot of information, to summarize and think more deeply and pull in annotated information from multiple different directions so that I can effectively talk about these things. Well, look, anybody can use the technology and they can coordinate so that they can really make a big impact in a much shorter time. And that's exactly what Anthropic is telling us here. So, what exactly happened? Well, straight up, we're talking about a state sponsored organization. What does that mean exactly? Well, there's a country and it's probably tied to military. That's why we're talking about espionage. But the key here is that not only did they set up to go after it, they had a very specific set of targets. They knew exactly what they were after. They understood and know the discipline of cyber manipulation to achieve a larger goal. This wasn't just, hey, Claude, go hack somebody for me. Oh, no, it was a lot more sophisticated. also a much bigger scale and a much greater level of efficacy through the partnership between humans and AI. And see, this is the key that I want to really call out here. And this is straight up where we are with autonomy and AI. Look, you may talk to the average Joe on the street about AI, and everybody knows about ChatGPT. Everybody knows you can type something in. We just finally got beyond the M dash problem with GPT 5.1, where you can actually go and say, hey, stop using the M dashes. I don't want to see that in the text you give me back. That's actually effective now. As of this week, 5.1 came out as well. That's the other big news that's dropping. But I think this is bigger news because what we're seeing here is not only are these AI agents being effective, but they are fast. It is allowing things to happen at a pace that really nobody anticipated. And it was effective, right? Not only was it able to do the work, but it did it very quickly. And the thing about computers and machines is they don't ever forget. And there's some elements to this attack that I think are really essential for us to understand. But it's also the methodology that they used. They were leveraging the automation of Claude code to execute the grunt work, those little details. Look, you and I just can't type fast enough to keep up with the machines. And they took advantage of that in this situation. They put in the checkpoints, they put in the stop or the instruction or the check-in so that things were timed exactly the right way for an effective cyber attack. But then for all of the other areas that could be automated where the agent was doing the infiltration or the inspection or the extraction, that was entirely automated. And Anthropic told us, look, this was not your typical session with AI where you're getting advice. This was execution all the way. And so they really did plug in the parts of human versus AI engagement here to get the best possible outcome in the shortest possible time. The humans were selecting the targets, the AI was running the tactical operations, and then it was having that final checkpoint with the humans on when they would actually begin the various phases. Because if you are doing a cyber attack, it's not as simple as hit a target and see what happens. No, no, there's actually quite a bit to this. So let me break it down. There's a couple of pieces here that I want to help you understand. The first is you can't go into Claude and just say go hack a company. It's not going to let you do that. The model is intelligent enough. There are components to that setup that are going to prevent those kinds of bad actions from happening. So they had to jailbreak the model. What did they do? You're a penetration tester. This is defensive work. They convinced the model that what they were doing was innocent or that it did not have malintent behind it. And then they stacked that with this micro task view. What does that mean? It means that they broke down the work in such a small level of work that it was very hard to detect that they were doing something on a much larger scale. They were taking the scan and doing that independent. And then over here in another agent, it was doing encryption. And then in a third agent, it was doing deletion of a file. Each of these things taken unto itself didn't really look like anything that was a problem. But when you take them together and you see their connection, now we're talking about something that's a bigger deal. And what does that mean? Well, I mean, they gave us a couple of good charts here to actually take us through this. Their architecture, from a simplified standpoint, is pretty straightforward. And I think this is the reality of the agentic world that we are moving into. You are going to need to break your tasks down into smaller pieces. This concept of leveraging MCP for individual tools or for executing work is an essential part of the architecture they used. And it also allowed them to break up the work so that it was harder to inspect. So this is a functional architecture, not just in terms of getting the work done, but actually in terms of being effective in carrying out a cyber attack that was not something they wanted to be discovered. there is a level of cat and mouse here, right? Anthropic has to do the work in order to understand how people are using their software, and they are accountable for that. But broken down and taken apart, they were able to be effective by breaking it down from an AI execution standpoint and from a cyber protection, cyber attack hiding perspective. The other piece of this from an infrastructure standpoint that I want to call out is they took each of the phases and also leveraged a different set of tools across those phases and used them in different ways, checking in with the human to validate the findings. So for example, in the early phases, you're going to carry out a certain amount of reconnaissance, and in the later phases you're going to exfiltrate that data, and you need to do that in a way that also prevents you from being noticed. Let's go through that overall view of what it looks like to actually go through one of these attacks. Using the tools, it's MCP, it's autonomous agents that are doing the work. It is a pipeline that is built to take best advantage of that. And then, of course, it wouldn't be worth it unless they made the attack persistent and actually stayed around. So, look, I'm not going to go into the detail phases, but just to give you a quick overall understanding, there are 6 pieces to this that matter. One, it's looking at the environment, right? Are there vulnerabilities to be taken advantage of? Understanding what that environment looks like. And then once they discover something that gets them in, then they start figuring out how to start using that. And then they are gathering information. So now they're looking for credentials. They're looking for opportunities to execute the payload, what systems matter. And as they figure that out, they're going to get in, they're going to move around and put themselves in the right position to take advantage of what they're searching for. And then they're going to pull the data out and use it, right? Whether that's documentation, whether that's exploitation, where they're selling information to other people. You know, what's really interesting about this is this process is not new, right? What's new here is the AI agents. So, this is the thing that we have to understand. While the agents were 80 to 90% of the work, you still have the challenges of the AI mistakes, and hallucinations is definitely one of those areas, right? Here's the thing. When you're trying to gather credentials, if you get fake credentials, that's actually a real problem. But the way that they were executing their work, that was not an issue that prevented them from being effective. So when we go back to that 80 to 90% effective, here's the reality with any AI, it doesn't have to be perfect for it to be really valuable. It's how we act with that imperfect information that ultimately matters. Whether it is identifying the credentials that work, whether it is identifying the right data that we're trying to get brought into the process, whether it is summarizing or understanding what's been happening there, the human validation here, I think, is the really critical part that we have to take into consideration. And when we talk about the wider impact of AI agents, this is something that I want to harp on a little bit because I really see in my own experiences, in the tools that I use, in the platforms that I work with, the human engagement is absolutely essential. You cannot take that out. And when you try to make it an entirely autonomous process that does not have any human engagement, it just doesn't go right. There are problems involved. And I think that this report really highlights some of those elements. What you see here in each of these phases is the human operator is deciding what happens. Now, here's the thing. When you're working inside of Claude Code, for example, there is a certain amount of, hey, go do this. And the agents are launching, they're getting the work done, and you have to be ready to answer that. And if you're trying to do a lot of work, some development folks are launching many of these and they're just watching the console. They're there the whole time. Other times they've got a swivel chair and they're going lots of different directions, and the execution finishes and it sits there and waits for them to take action. They took advantage of that way of executing inside of Claude Code to inject the human decisioning around the execution. So that very first phase where it is deciding what to target, that's entirely human driven. Then after the findings are taken, the human is looking at that and performing some analysis. And I want to be clear here. That means that to a significant degree, the command and control of the execution here was not governed by the agents. There was no, hey, Claude, figure out which thing to target. Now, I suppose that it is possible to do that. But again, I think there's some bigger issues behind the scenes. It's much harder to hide that intention because you have to bring in all of the context and show your cards in order for the AI to be effective. So, what better opportunity here to hide those things in the cyber attack by simply not letting an AI model understand the larger picture? If you can hide those details, that's what's important. So putting the human in the right place was also essential to their success, both in terms of the use of the AI and in terms of achieving the goals without being detected. Now, ultimately, I think the takeaway here is that Anthropic did figure this out. And I think we need to talk about what this means for you and I in terms of how we are using it. I think the very first thing is to really take these architectures to heart. What does that mean? Break your stuff down into phases. Don't do everything at once. Put that intentional human decision making in place and break down the steps so that you have small modules of work that you can have the agent go and work on very quickly. When you think about the level of work that's required for your average cyber attack, this really was accelerated by the nature of how they built this out, both from an execution standpoint and from a data aggregation standpoint. There's so many elements to this that I think are really brilliant. And it's great that Anthropic gave us all of these details to work with to really understand what all of this means. And then they told us what they're doing to disrupt and really what it means for us going forward, because this is becoming the big driver, right? They are working on better detection of anomalous activity. What does that mean? Well, I think it's very clear that it does mean that what you and I are doing on these tools is absolutely being watched. But another element is, look, doing account banning is essential both to protecting the environment at large and protecting their bottom line. Here's the thing. They are actually going out and identifying these accounts and banning them, permanently banning them. And that means that Anthropic is turning down the revenue that comes from the use of those tools. So they are, in fact, losing money by turning these things off. But I think we all understand that that's what's required for us to continue having these tools. That is the trade off. And there have been folks that have talked about losing their account access. You know, one of the more interesting ones that's occurring is when OpenAI released their new Sora 2 model, then it became sort of a social media account. If that account gets banned, it's gone. All of your ChatGPT logs are gone. So, you know, this account banning thing is not insignificant or insubstantial. That's a big deal. And Anthropic is doing the right things. They are engaging those organizations that are affected as they see what's happening. They're doing what's necessary. They're reporting this to the authorities. It's not as though it's going to make a great deal of difference. It's not like you're going to send the police department after a nation state. I mean, come on, let's be honest. But these are details that matter and might have downstream influence or impact. It's also important for us to understand exactly what they're doing, how they're doing it, and what that means for us. And of course, the last thing here is understanding what they can do with the model to prevent this kind of activity. Because here's the reality that we are in, okay? There's three real big takeaways that I want you to understand. The first is leveraging that combination of human and AI together. That is the lesson here. But there's also another piece of this that is so essential, and that is break down the problem and start experimenting. The smaller you start, the more likely you are to be successful. And if you can find ways to do that, this is the future for you and I. What are you working on? What are you thinking about? Break it down. You can even use the AI to help you break it down. I mean, it's not like you and I are doing cyber warfare. We don't need to hide what we're doing. We can be out in the open and you can use the intelligence and the model to help you break it down. But what I have learned is getting to that step by step, getting to that granularity of action is how you can be successful with these agent models, whether it is simply running a complex prompt in your chat GPT session or actually developing an AI agent. I get the joy of working with AI agents every day on a really powerful platform that does that. But also, you don't have to be in a big platform to have an agent and to do really useful things. It can be something as simple as thinking about your goals, right? I've gotten into the habit now of having a session on a daily basis that is scheduled. And it has me thinking about the bigger goals that I'm trying to achieve. It's asking me questions about what am I going to do today, right? I'm using it as my own coach. I know what I want to achieve, and I'm thinking deeply about that, but I'm also using it to remind me and coach me through those little steps that are necessary for being successful so that I don't fall off the truck, so that I don't stop the momentum of moving forward. And I think that is the other piece here. When you look at the architecture, right, they built this in a way that they could have multiple different targets in various different phases, ready and waiting. And then they built the framework so that it was a human decision. When they said go, it took care of doing that work in the fastest possible way. The other thing about this is by putting in these gates and leveraging that human decision, they were able to bring in any other external information that was relevant, right? If you're trying to extort someone, you want to know if they've paid, right? You can turn on and turn off. It doesn't have to be an AI decision. I think that one of the challenges that we have going forward is that decisioning and thinking about what we should do. So many of us are overwhelmed in our daily life that we just lose that agency. And I think that's the biggest mistake you could make. So don't make that mistake. Keep your agency, keep the control. The human is the most important, and find ways to use these AI agents to make your life better. Try it out. You really can't tell what's good and what's bad, what's useful until you try it. And you might learn something really vital along the way. And that's what we're all searching for. Everybody wants to know what's the best practice? How do you do this? How did you do it? That's the key. And you can only get that by actually doing the work. So go make some mistakes and learn. We'll see you next time here on AI Mistakes.